The silence in the old house on Maple Street wasn't peaceful. It was the kind that pressed in thick and heavy, like dust settling on forgotten things. It was the silence of waiting for what Eleanor Reed couldn't say. Not anymore. October 28th, a Tuesday. Rain lashed the grimy windows of the Victorian Eleanor had inherited 3 months prior. It wasn't a gift she'd wanted. It was an obligation, a heavy, awkward box delivered by the impersonal hands of lawyers, containing the physical remnants of a strained relationship with her Aunt Agatha. The house loomed, all dark wood, high ceilings, and shadows that seemed to deepen as the days shortened. Outside, the world was a watercolor blur of dying leaves and slick pavement. Inside, just damp chill, the faint scent of mildew and old paper, and that crushing silence. Eleanor felt adrift. 42, freshly divorced, her graphic design business struggling in the shift to remote work she couldn't quite master, and now, the caretaker of a decaying monument to a woman she'd found distant, even forbidding. She'd moved in because selling it felt like admitting defeat on multiple fronts, and renting her tiny city apartment covered the taxes. Mostly, the plan was vague. Fix it up? Sell it eventually? The possibilities were as murky as the rainwater pooling on the porch. She spent her days wrapped in thick sweaters, moving between the marginally less chilly kitchen and the living room where a single-space heater battled valiantly against the drafts. Boxes stood half unpacked, monuments to her inertia. The house creaked and groaned, settling sighs that echoed her own. She missed the hum of city life outside her window, the certainty of her old routines. Here, the quiet was a mirror reflecting her own hollowness. Guilt too gnawed at her. Guilt for not trying harder with Aunt Agatha, guilt for the relief she'd felt when the call about the will came, guilt for this overwhelming sense of being utterly, completely lost. The sound. It started a week after she moved in. A faint scuffling, like dried leaves skittering across a floorboard. High up, Eleanor would freeze, mug halfway to her lips, straining to hear. Nothing. Just the rain, the wind, the house breathing. She chalked it up to squirrels in the eaves. Old houses had tenants, her realtor had said cheerfully. Probably rats, she thought grimly. But it persisted. Always at dusk, or in the deep quiet just before dawn. A subtle disturbance in the oppressive silence. It made her skin prickle. Was it just the house? Or her loneliness conjuring phantoms? One rain-sodden afternoon, seeking a specific wrench in the cluttered utility closet under the stairs, Eleanor disturbed a stack of ancient paint cans. As they clattered, a small, terrified blur shot out from the dark recesses behind them, a flash of matted gray fur, and vanished up the steep, narrow staircase leading to the second floor. Her heart hammered. Not a squirrel. Not a rat. A cat. She hadn't known Aunt Agatha had a pet. The lawyer hadn't mentioned it. Had it been trapped down here since the funeral? The thought sent a jolt of sickening guilt through her. 3 months? Surviving on what? Dripping pipes? Insects? The image was horrific. Eleanor spent the next 2 days trying to coax it out. She left bowls of tuna, then expensive wet food, near the closet door. Water. A soft towel in a cardboard box. She sat on the bottom step for hours, speaking softly, nonsense words about the weather, the leaky faucet in the kitchen, how big and empty the house felt. Nothing. The food vanished overnight, the water lapped at, but the cat remained an unseen phantom, its presence marked only by the softest rustle from the shadows and the increasingly persistent scuffling sounds from above. It seemed to live primarily on the second floor now, avoiding her. The first time she saw him properly was pure accident. She'd been wrestling with a stuck window in the drafty upstairs hallway, grunting with effort, when she felt it, the weight of a stare. She turned slowly. He sat at the far end of the dim corridor, just outside the door to the unused guest room. Not cowering, not hiding, just sitting, watching her. A medium-sized cat, his long fur a tangled tapestry of gray and muted brown tabby stripes, thick with dust and cobwebs. He looked thin beneath the fluff, but it was his eyes that arrested her. Large, round, and an extraordinary pale green, like moss on sun-bleached stone. They held no fear now, just a deep, unnerving stillness, and an intelligence that felt almost human. He didn't blink. He just observed, assessing. Eleanor held her breath. "Hello," she whispered, the words seeming too loud in the stillness. "It's okay. I won't hurt you." The cat didn't move, didn't flinch. His gaze remained fixed on her face, unreadable. Then, slowly, deliberately, he lifted one paw and began to clean it, the rasp of his tongue loud in the quiet. It wasn't dismissive, it felt deliberate, ritualistic almost, as if he was saying, "I see you. I'm here. We are both here." After a minute, he simply stood, turned with a quiet dignity that belied his bedraggled state, and padded silently into the dark maw of the guest room, disappearing from view. Eleanor leaned against the window frame, her palms damp. It wasn't just a stray. This cat, he belonged here. He knew this house, knew its silences, its rhythms. He was a relic, like the heavy furniture and the faded wallpaper. And those eyes, they held a history she couldn't fathom. A chill unrelated to the draft crept up her spine, but it was mingled with something else, a spark of connection, fragile as a cobweb. This silent, watchful creature was the only other heartbeat in this echoing tomb of a house. She named him Silas. It suited his ancient, watchful aura. Days settled into a new, tentative rhythm. Eleanor worked at her laptop in the chilly living room. Silas remained elusive, a ghost haunting the upper floor. She'd catch glimpses, the tip of a dusty tail disappearing around a corner, the reflective flash of his green eyes from the top of the stairs in the gloom of evening. He ate the food she left diligently in the upstairs hallway, but only when she was downstairs. The bowl would be meticulously licked clean, the water disturbed. He used the litter box she'd placed discreetly near the bathroom door. A practical acceptance, but no trust offered. The scuffling sounds continued, mostly at night. They seemed concentrated, not random exploration. One location. Eleanor started paying closer attention, lying awake in her cold bedroom, listening. The sounds came from the end of the hall, near the guest room, yes, but past it? There was only a blank wall there, papered over in the same faded floral pattern as the rest of the hallway. And above, the attic. The pull-down ladder was in the ceiling of the hallway, just outside her own bedroom door. She'd looked up there once, on her initial exploration. Just dusty beams, insulation, a few discarded trunks. Nothing remarkable. The sounds Silas made weren't in the attic space. They seemed to be coming from behind the wall adjacent to it. A cavity? Pipes? It didn't make sense. One rainy night, the wind howling like a banshee around the eaves, Eleanor lay awake, the house groaning under the assault. The familiar scuffling started again, louder tonight. More insistent. Then a new sound. Not a scuffle. A scrape. Deliberate. Rhythmic. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Followed by a pause. Then again. Scritch, scritch, scritch. It wasn't random clawing. It was focused. Persistent. Like someone or something trying to get out. Eleanor sat up, her heart pounding against her ribs. She slipped out of bed, pulling her robe tight, and crept to her bedroom door, opening it a crack. The hallway was pitch black, the only light the faint glow from her room. The sound was unmistakable now. It was coming from the end of the hall, from that blank section of wall just past the guest room door. Right where she'd first seen Silas watching her. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Hesitant, her breath fogging in the cold air, she took a few steps down the hall. She could just make out a shape in the deeper darkness near the wall. Silas. He was standing on his hind legs, his front paws braced against the faded wallpaper. He wasn't frantic. He was working. Methodically. Dragging his claws down the same small patch, over and over. Scritch, scritch, scritch. He stopped abruptly, sensing her presence. He turned his head slowly. Those pale green eyes caught the sliver of light from her doorway, glowing with an unearthly luminescence. He stared at her, not with fear, but with an intensity that felt like a physical touch. A silent communication. Listen. Then, without a sound, he dropped to all fours, gave the wall one last, lingering look, and melted into the shadows of the guest room doorway, vanishing as completely as if he'd never been there. Eleanor stood frozen in the icy hallway, the rhythmic scraping echoing in her mind. The wind rattled the window at the end of the hall. Rain drummed on the roof. But all she could hear was that deliberate, insistent sound and the sudden, deafening roar of her own pulse in her ears. It wasn't just noise. Silas wasn't just scratching. He was trying to tell her something. He was showing her a place, a secret held within the bones of Aunt Agatha's house. The oppressive silence of the place shifted, replaced by a low, resonant hum of hidden significance. The empty corridors, the dusty rooms, Silas's watchful eyes, they all converged on that patch of faded wallpaper. Something important, something long buried, was beginning to stir. Not just in the house, but deep within Eleanor herself. A quiet shift, not just in the shadows on Maple Street, but in the very center of her numb, lonely heart. The silence was gone, replaced by a question, scratched into the night. The deliberate scritch, scritch, scritch against the wallpaper didn't fade with the storm. It echoed in Eleanor's mind long after the rain stopped, long after the gray light of dawn seeped into the high windows of the hallway. That blank wall, with its faded peonies and ivy, suddenly felt charged. Like a locked diary. Silas hadn't been frantic. He'd been purposeful. Showing her. But showing her what? The practicalities of life, however, pressed in. The persistent dampness in the air seemed to seep into her bones. The ancient furnace wheezed and clanked, offering little real heat. Eleanor knew she needed to tackle the attic insulation, a task she'd been dreading. The pull-down ladder was stiff, groaning in protest as she finally managed to lower it, releasing a shower of dust motes that danced in the weak morning light. The smell that wafted down was thick, undisturbed decades. Dry wood, ancient insulation like compacted gray wool, and the faint, sweet decay of forgotten paper. She climbed, flashlight beam cutting a shaky path through the gloom. Cobwebs draped like ghostly lace from the rafters. Trunks, shrouded in dusty sheets, huddled near the chimney breast. Boxes labeled in a shaky, unfamiliar hand, Christmas decorations, Agatha's college, mother's linens. The space felt less like storage and more like a tomb for memories not her own. The scuffling sounds Silas made, they hadn't seemed to come from up here. They'd felt lower, behind that wall. She shone the light towards the end wall of the attic, the one directly above the hallway where Silas scratched. Solid studs, thick insulation bats packed between them. Nothing unusual. Just the bones of the house, hidden and cold. Descending, dust streaked across her forehead and sweater. Eleanor felt a wave of futility. What was she even looking for? A hidden door? A message? It felt absurd. She was chasing the behavior of a traumatized, half-feral cat in a house full of echoes. She found Silas waiting, not at the scratching spot. He was sitting primly at the top of the stairs leading down to the first floor, his back to her, a dusty gray statue gazing into the dimness below. He didn't turn as she approached, but the tip of his tail gave a single, slow flick. Acknowledgement? Or impatience? Checking up on me? Eleanor murmured, her voice raspy from the attic dust. She moved past him carefully, her shoulder brushing against the peeling wallpaper. He didn't flinch, didn't move, just watched her descend. Later that afternoon, thawing her hands around a mug of strong tea at the cluttered kitchen table, Eleanor heard the soft thump of paws landing on linoleum. Silas stood in the doorway, not venturing in, just present. His green eyes fixed on her, unblinking. The silence stretched, filled only by the ticking of the old wall clock, a sound she usually found oppressive. Now it felt companionable. Hungry? She asked softly, more to break the quiet than expecting an answer. She stood slowly, not wanting to startle him, and moved to the counter where his food bowl sat. She scooped the expensive pâté, chicken and liver, the pet store clerk had assured her it was irresistible, into the clean ceramic dish. The smell was pungent, meaty. She placed it carefully on the floor just inside the kitchen doorway. Silas didn't move immediately. He watched her retreat back to her chair. He watched the bowl. His nostrils flared, testing the air. Then, with a fluid grace that belied his matted fur, he padded silently forward. He didn't look at her. His focus was entirely on the food. He lowered his head, ate quickly, efficiently, the only sound the quiet smacking of his lips and the scrape of the ceramic as he cleaned the bowl meticulously. He lapped water from the adjacent dish, then sat back, giving his chest a few cursory licks. His gaze lifted, met hers again. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't affection. It was assessment. Acknowledgement of a transaction completed. Then, he turned and vanished back into the shadowed hallway. But he'd eaten while she was in the room. That was new. The days began to knit together with these small, fragile threads of contact. Eleanor started talking. Not to Silas, exactly, but into the silence he inhabited. She'd comment on the relentless rain drumming against the windows. She'd mutter about the stubborn latch on the pantry door. She'd sigh over a difficult client email. It filled the void, this one-sided conversation. It made the house feel less like an echo chamber for her loneliness. And Silas, he listened. Or seemed to. He'd often be there, a shadow at the periphery, perched on the bottom step of the main staircase while she worked in the living room. Sitting just outside the kitchen doorway as she washed dishes, the warm, damp smell of soap mingling with the faint, dusty scent he carried. He became a fixture, a silent witness to her attempts to impose order on the chaos of the house and her own life. One bitterly cold afternoon, the sky the color of lead, Eleanor tackled a box marked, "Dining Room Miscellaneous," in Aunt Agatha's tight script. Inside were tarnished silver candlesticks, a cracked porcelain shepherdess, and a photograph. It was tucked beneath a folded damask tablecloth that smelled faintly of cedar and disuse. Eleanor pulled it out. Black and white, slightly faded. A much younger Agatha, perhaps in her 30s, stood stiffly beside a handsome man with a kind, open face. He had his arm around her waist. Agatha wasn't smiling, not exactly, but there was a softness around her eyes Eleanor had never seen in life. A tenderness. They stood on the porch of this very house, the wisteria vine young and sparse. Behind them, barely visible in the corner of the frame, sat a cat. A sleek, dark tabby, watching the camera with alert interest. Eleanor traced the image of the young Agatha. Who was the man? A husband? A fiancé? She'd never known Aunt Agatha to have anyone. The woman Eleanor remembered was sharp-tongued, fiercely private, always dressed in stiff tweed skirts, smelling of lavender sachets and something vaguely medicinal. This woman, she looked hopeful. A soft sound made her look up. Silas was sitting in the archway between the living room and the dining room where she knelt amidst the box's contents. He was watching her, not the photograph. His head tilted slightly, those pale green eyes seeming to absorb the sadness that had welled up in her, unbidden. Sadness for the young Agatha who'd lost, whatever this was. Sadness for the lonely woman she'd become. Sadness for herself, adrift in the aftermath of her own failed marriage. Not a grand tragedy, just a slow erosion of affection, leaving her feeling invisible. Unchosen. You knew her, didn't you? Eleanor whispered, her voice thick. The real her? Before she built all these walls. Silas blinked slowly. A deliberate, languid closing and opening of those mesmerizing eyes. A cat's gesture of trust, of calm. In the quiet gloom of the dining room, surrounded by the ghosts of Agatha's past, it felt like a profound answer. The scratching continued, always at the wall, always at dusk or dawn. Eleanor started mapping it. She'd sit on the floor in the hallway, her back against the opposite wall, a book open but unread on her knees. She'd listen. Scritch, scritch, this, scritch, scritch. It wasn't random. There was a pattern, a rhythm. It felt less like clawing and more like trying to communicate, like Morse code in plaster and paper. She began leaving Silas's food bowl near the scratching spot. Not right against the wall, but a few feet away. He'd emerge from the guest room, eat with his usual focused intensity, then pause. He'd look at the wall. Then often he'd look at her, sitting there in the dim light. Then he'd scratch, deliberately, almost demonstratively. One evening, after he'd eaten and performed his ritual scratching, he didn't immediately disappear. He sat down, facing the wall, his tail curled neatly around his paws. He just stayed. Eleanor stayed too. The silence wasn't empty now. It was filled with his quiet presence, the faint scent of dust and cat, the lingering aroma of his dinner, and the shared focus on that patch of wallpaper. It felt like a vigil, a shared secret. She found herself telling him things she hadn't voiced aloud to anyone. Not the polished version for friends, but the raw, messy truth. Mark said I was distant, she murmured, her voice barely disturbing the stillness. The name of her ex-husband felt strange on her tongue. Towards the end, he wasn't wrong. I just shut down. Couldn't figure out how to unshut. It was easier to just be quiet, be still, like disappearing into the wallpaper. Silas didn't turn, but his ear twitched, rotating slightly towards the sound of her voice. He was listening, truly listening. His stillness wasn't emptiness, it was profound attention. I think Aunt Agatha did the same, Eleanor continued, the realization dawning as she spoke. After whatever happened, she glanced towards the dining room, picturing the photograph. She built walls, real ones, thick ones, and she just lived behind them, became the stern, prickly woman I knew. Maybe it felt safer. She let out a shaky breath. Maybe it is safer. But God, Silas, it's so lonely. A profound quiet settled. The house held its breath. The only sound was Silas's soft, rhythmic breathing. Then, without warning, he stood. He didn't look at the wall. He turned and walked towards her. Not with his usual silent glide, but with a measured, deliberate pace. He stopped a foot away from where she sat on the floor, her knees drawn up. Eleanor froze. He'd never come this close voluntarily outside of feeding time. His eyes, luminous in the gloom, met hers. He held her gaze for a long, still moment. Then, slowly, deliberately, he took one more step forward. He stretched out his neck, his nose a fraction from her folded knee, but he didn't touch her. Instead, he lowered his head slightly and gave a single, soft blink. Slow, deliberate, a punctuation mark in the silent conversation. Then, he turned and walked back towards the guest room, pausing only to glance once more at the scratched section of wall before disappearing into the darkness. Eleanor sat on the cold hallway floor, the imprint of that slow blink burning in her mind. It wasn't affection, not quite. It was recognition, understanding, a silent echo of her own isolation reflected back at her, acknowledged, and somehow shared. The scent of dust and old house was suddenly layered with the faint, clean smell of his fur where he'd stood so close. The oppressive silence of Maple Street had been replaced by something else entirely, the quiet hum of a fragile, burgeoning trust. It wasn't loud. It wasn't dramatic. It was just a paw placed tentatively on the vast, cold expanse of her loneliness. A silent whisper, "I see you. I'm here too." The slow blink, that deliberate, silent punctuation in the dim hallway. It hung in Eleanor's mind like a single, perfect note, resonating long after Silas had vanished into the guest room shadows. It wasn't affection, not in the way humans understood it. It was deeper, a recognition of shared territory, the desolate landscape of loneliness they both inhabited within these walls. It shifted something fundamental. The house no longer felt like Agatha's tomb or just Eleanor's cage. It felt like theirs. A shared, crumbling sanctuary. Silas didn't suddenly become a lap cat. He remained elusive, a creature of thresholds and shadows. But the nature of his presence changed. He started appearing before the scratching ritual. Eleanor would be sitting on the cold hallway floor, trying to decipher the pattern in the wallpaper's faded vines, and she'd feel the subtle shift in the air, the faintest vibration on the floorboards. She'd look up and he'd be there, sitting a few feet away, already gazing at the spot. Waiting. It felt like an invitation, a silent summons to witness. One evening, emboldened by this fragile new dynamic, Eleanor did something reckless. As Silas finished his focused scritch, and paused, his dusty flank heaving slightly, she slowly reached out her hand. Not to touch him, that felt like a violation of their unspoken treaty, but towards the wall itself. Towards the area his claws had worked relentlessly, night after night. The wallpaper was thick, old, layered like sedimentary rock. Decades of paste and time. But under her fingertips, where Silas had concentrated his efforts, it felt different. Slightly softer. The surface fibers were frayed, worn thin. Almost yielding. Silas froze. Utterly still. Not a twitch of a whisker. His pale green eyes fixed on her hand, then flicked to her face. There was no aggression, no fear. Only intense, laser-focused scrutiny. As if holding his breath. Gently, Eleanor pressed her index finger against the worn spot. She applied the slightest pressure, more of an exploratory nudge than a push. Beneath the paper, something gave. Not much. Just a faint, almost imperceptible give. Like pressing on old, dry leather. It wasn't solid plaster underneath. It felt hollow? Or covered by something thin and brittle. A tiny fragment of wallpaper, loosened by her touch and Silas's relentless work, flaked off and drifted silently to the floor. Beneath it, not the expected plaster or laugh. Just darkness. A sliver of profound black. Eleanor snatched her hand back as if burned. Her heart hammered against her ribs. Silas didn't move. He stared at the tiny black void revealed by the fallen paper scrap, then slowly, deliberately lifted his gaze back to Eleanor. That look, it wasn't surprise. It was confirmation. See? He stood, stretched languidly, his spine arching like a drawn bow, then turned and padded silently back to the guest room. His job, for now, was done. He'd shown her the keyhole. The rest was hers. The tiny black void beneath the wallpaper became an obsession. It was a physical manifestation of the questions Silas had been scratching into her consciousness. What was behind there? Why was Silas so fixated? And what did Aunt Agatha have to do with it? The practicalities felt overwhelming. Tearing into the wall felt like sacrilege and potentially disastrous. What if it was structural? What if it unleashed a cascade of crumbling plaster, exposing wiring, or worse? The weight of the house, of Agatha's legacy, pressed down. Eleanor found herself paralyzed by indecision, haunted by the imagined disapproval in Agatha's stern, photographed gaze. Then the external pressure arrived. A crisp white envelope in the mailbox. Not a bill. A letter from a local realtor, Lydia Vance. Dear Ms. Reed, it began with impersonal cheer. Asterisk, having noticed you are the new owner of the distinctive Victorian property at 17 Maple Street, I wanted to reach out personally. Properties of this vintage and character are increasingly rare and sought after in our current market. Even in as-is condition, I believe your home holds significant potential value. I would be delighted to offer a complimentary market analysis and discuss how we might position this unique property to achieve top dollar, allowing you to move forward unburdened. Asterisk. Unburdened. The word echoed in the silent kitchen. Eleanor crumpled the letter, the paper crackling loudly in the stillness. Move forward? To what? Her tiny rented apartment felt like a distant, sterile memory. The thought of strangers traipsing through these rooms, judging Agatha's dusty furniture, Silas's hiding spots, that wall, it felt invasive, violating. A fresh wave of guilt crashed over her, guilt for considering selling Agatha's history, guilt for clinging to a decaying house she couldn't afford to fix, guilt for the irrational protectiveness she felt towards a half-wild cat and a hidden void. Silas seemed to sense the shift in her energy. He became more present. Not closer physically, but his watchfulness intensified. He'd appear in doorways as she paced the living room, his green eyes tracking her agitation. When she sat slumped at the kitchen table, staring at the crumpled realtor letter, he'd sit just inside the dining room archway, a silent, dusty sentinel. His stillness was no longer just observation. It felt like a quiet counterweight to her turmoil. A reminder of the persistent, patient mystery that existed beyond the immediate pressure. One afternoon, driven by a desperate need for answers, Eleanor ventured into the depths of the town library's historical archives. Dust motes danced in the slanted sunlight as she pored over microfiche copies of old newspapers and brittle city planning documents. She searched for any mention of 17 Maple Street, any building permits, any scandals. She found mundane entries about property taxes, A small notice about Agatha's father passing ownership to her in 1972. And then, tucked in the corner of a 1958 Planning Department update, a minor permit approval for interior structural modifications, rear wall, second floor, 17 Maple Street owner, A. Finch. Agatha's maiden name, Finch. The description was infuriatingly vague. Modifications. But the date nagged at her. 1958. Agatha would have been in her late 20s. Around the time of the photograph with the unknown man and the sleek tabby cat. Before the walls went up. Literally? Returning home, the weight of the mystery felt heavier. The house greeted her with its familiar chill and silence. Silas was waiting at the top of the stairs. As she climbed, he didn't retreat. He watched her approach, then turned and walked purposefully down the hall, stopping right at the spot. He sat, facing the wall, his tail wrapped neatly around him. Waiting. Eleanor knelt beside him, not too close. The tiny black void where the paper had flaked off seemed to stare back. "I found something," she whispered, the sound swallowed by the hallway's stillness. "From 1958. They changed something. Back here." She touched the worn wallpaper gently, near the void. "What did she hide, Silas? What are you trying to show me?" Silas didn't look at her. He kept his gaze fixed on the wall. But he shifted slightly, leaning his shoulder fractionally towards her. A subtle, almost imperceptible pressure against her arm. It lasted only a second, a fleeting point of contact, dusty fur against her sweater sleeve. Warmth. Solidarity. Then he was still again, a statue focused on the secret within the wall. It wasn't affection. It was alliance. He was telling her she wasn't alone in this. The burden was shared. The tension coiled tighter. The realtor, Lydia Vance, called. Her voice was smooth, professional, relentless. "Just a quick walkthrough, Ms. Reed. No obligation whatsoever. It helps me give you the most accurate picture of your options." So many possibilities. Eleanor stammered a non-committal reply, hanging up feeling flustered and cornered. The house suddenly felt less like a sanctuary and more like a ticking clock. That night, the scratching was different. More urgent. Scritch, scritch, scritch. Fuzz. Scritch. Insistent. Demanding. Eleanor lay in bed, listening, the sound vibrating through the floorboards into her bones. Silas wasn't just showing her anymore. He was pushing. Time was running out, and he knew it. Driven by a mix of anxiety, defiance against Lydia Vance's cheerful pressure, and the insistent rhythm from the hall, Eleanor acted. In the cold, pre-dawn grayness, armed only with a butter knife and a desperate need to know, she returned to the wall. Silas was there, of course. He watched, unblinking, as she carefully inserted the thin blade into the tiny black void. The old wallpaper adhesive was brittle. It cracked and flaked. Gently, painstakingly, Eleanor worked the knife tip, levering upwards. A small section, about the size of her palm, began to peel away from the wall beneath. It wasn't plaster. It was another layer, something thin and dark. Fabric? Thick paper? Her fingers trembled. Silas leaned forward, his nose almost touching the expanding gap. His breath came in short, quiet puffs, fogging slightly in the cold air. Eleanor peeled back a little more. The dark layer beneath wasn't the back of the wallpaper. It was separate, intentional, and tucked just behind the peeling edge of the dark layer. She saw it. Not a message. Not a treasure. Something small. Angular. Made of wood? Or perhaps metal? It was impossible to tell in the gloom. But it was man-made. Deliberately placed. Hidden. Before she could reach for it, a sharp, authoritative knock echoed through the silent house. Rap, rap, rap. Eleanor jumped, her heart leaping into her throat. Silas vanished instantly, a gray streak disappearing into the guest room. Eleanor scrambled to her feet, hastily smoothing the peeled section of wallpaper back over the hidden object as best she could. It looked terrible, obviously disturbed. The knock came again. Louder. Rap, rap, rap. Peering down the stairs from the dim hallway, Eleanor saw the silhouette through the frosted glass of the front door. A woman. Sharp shoulders. Neat hair. Lydia Vance. She'd come anyway. Ms. Reed? Lydia Vance. Just following up. Hope I'm not catching you at a bad time? The voice was bright, piercing the fragile silence Eleanor and Silas had woven. Eleanor stood frozen at the top of the stairs, her hand pressed against the damaged wallpaper, feeling the hidden shape beneath. The secret Agatha had sealed away. The secret Silas had guarded and revealed. The realtor's cheerful persistence felt like an invasion, a bulldozer poised to flatten the fragile understanding growing between a lonely woman and a mysterious cat. The warmth of Silas's fleeting touch was gone, replaced by the icy dread of exposure. The quiet shift in her heart had become a frantic pounding against her ribs. The house held its breath. The choice was no longer abstract. Open the door to the future Lydia Vance offered, or turn back to the past Silas was so desperately trying to uncover. The scratched question on the wall had just become deafening. The cheerful knocking reverberated through the silent house like gunfire. Rap, rap, rap. Each impact vibrated up the staircase, jolting Eleanor where she stood frozen, her palms still pressed flat against the damaged wallpaper, feeling the distinct, angular shape hidden beneath. Lydia Vance's silhouette, sharp and expectant behind the frosted glass, was a stark invasion of the fragile, sacred space she and Silas had carved out in the pre-dawn gloom. Silas was gone. Vanished into the guest room's shadows the instant the sound shattered the stillness. The air felt abruptly empty, charged only with the frantic drumming of Eleanor's heart and the unwelcome presence beyond the door. Ms. Reed? It's Lydia Vance. Just popping by as promised. Lovely morning, isn't it? The voice, muffled but relentlessly upbeat, pierced through the wood. Panic, cold and slick, washed over Eleanor. She couldn't let Lydia in. Not like this. Not with the wall torn open, the secret exposed, and Silas somewhere, terrified. The thought of the sleek, professional woman's assessing gaze sweeping over Agatha's dusty sanctuary, over that wall, over Silas cowering, it felt like a profound violation. A wave of fierce, unexpected protectiveness surged through her, momentarily eclipsing her usual indecision. She took a shaky breath, forcing her hand away from the wall. The damaged paper curled slightly at the edges, a blatant sign of disturbance. Just a minute, she called, her voice sounding unnaturally high and thin. She hurried down the stairs, her bare feet cold on the worn wood, pausing only to grab a dusty throw blanket draped over the newel post. At the door, she took another steadying breath, smoothed her rumpled sleep shirt, and pasted on what she hoped resembled a polite, flustered expression. Opening the door just a crack, the chill morning air rushed in. Lydia Vance stood there, impeccably dressed in a tailored wool coat, a bright silk scarf at her neck, her smile as polished as her briefcase. Her eyes, sharp and assessing, immediately scanned the dim foyer behind Eleanor. Ms. Reed. So sorry to drop by unannounced. I was just in the neighborhood showing another property and thought, well, why not swing by? Hope I didn't wake you? Her gaze flickered past Eleanor, taking in the grand, if neglected, staircase, the high ceilings. No, just doing some early morning organizing, Eleanor stammered, shifting slightly to block the view further into the house. She clutched the throw blanket tighter around her shoulders like a shield. It's not really a good time, Miss Vance. The house is, well, it's in quite a state. Nonsense. Lydia waved a dismissive, perfectly manicured hand. I've seen it all, believe me. Part of the charm of these old gems is seeing the potential beneath the character. Her smile widened, but her eyes remained calculating. Just a quick peek? 5 minutes? I can already tell this entryway has wonderful bones. Imagine it with fresh paint, maybe a statement pendant light. She took a small, decisive step forward, clearly intending to edge past Eleanor. The scent of expensive perfume clashed violently with the house's familiar smells of dust and old wood. Eleanor instinctively stiffened, planting her feet more firmly. Really, Eleanor said, her voice firmer now, laced with a tension she couldn't hide. Not today. I appreciate the offer, but I need to focus on some personal matters. Perhaps another time? Lydia's smile faltered, replaced by a flicker of professional impatience. She clearly wasn't used to resistance. Ms. Reed, she said, her tone dropping slightly, becoming more confidential, almost conspiratorial. I understand sentiment, truly, but clinging to a property that's clearly burdensome emotionally and financially, it's not wise. The market is hot right now. This place, even needing work, could set you up very comfortably elsewhere. Free you up. Think of the possibilities. Burdensome. The word struck Eleanor like a physical blow. This house was a burden. Cold, decaying, full of ghosts and mysteries she didn't understand. It was expensive. It was isolating. Lydia's logic was impeccable, practical, cold. It echoed the sensible voice in her own head that had urged her to sell immediately. But as Lydia spoke, Eleanor's gaze drifted upwards, past the realtor's shoulder, towards the top of the stairs. Silas was there, not hiding, standing at the very edge of the hallway, just visible from the foyer. He wasn't looking at Lydia. His intense, pale green eyes were fixed solely on Eleanor. Utterly still, utterly focused. Watching, waiting, a silent, dusty sentinel guarding the threshold to the secret above. Free you up. Lydia's words echoed. Free her to go back to what? A sterile apartment? A life defined by quiet failure and isolation? What was freedom when it meant abandoning this? Abandoning Silas? Abandoning the questions scratched into the wall, the hidden shape beneath the paper, the glimpse of a young Agatha who had loved and perhaps lost? Abandoning the fragile, wordless connection that had begun to thaw her own frozen heart? The weight of the house, Agatha's stern ghost, her own loneliness, the realtor's pragmatic pressure, it all condensed into a single, suffocating point. And Silas's unwavering gaze was the counterweight. A silent plea. Something inside Eleanor snapped. Not loudly, not violently, but decisively. The polite mask dissolved. No, she said, the word clear and surprisingly steady in the chilly air. She met Lydia Vance's surprised gaze directly. Thank you for your interest, Miss Vance, but the house is not for sale. Not now. Not anytime soon. I'll let you know if that changes. Good day. Before Lydia could formulate a response, Eleanor gently but firmly closed the door. The click of the latch was a final, resonant punctuation. She leaned her forehead against the cool wood, listening to the stunned silence from the other side, then the sharp click of high heels retreating down the porch steps. The silence inside the house rushed back, deeper now, charged with the echo of her own defiance. Her hands trembled. She had just turned away practicality, financial sense, perhaps even sanity, for what? A mystery? A cat? She turned slowly, her back against the door. Silas was still there at the top of the stairs, watching. He didn't move. He didn't blink. But as Eleanor met his gaze, something profound passed between them in the stillness. A shared breath. An acknowledgement of the line just drawn. He had witnessed her choice. The climb back up the stairs felt different. Lighter, yet charged with a new kind of gravity. The damaged section of wallpaper seemed to pulse with its own energy. Silas remained by the guest room door, a silent observer, as Eleanor knelt once more before the wall. The tiny black void where the paper had flaked off seemed larger now, an accusing eye. Her fingers, still trembling slightly but steadier than before, went back to the peeled section she'd hastily smoothed down. The brittle adhesive cracked easily. Gently, carefully, she lifted the loosened flap of thick, faded floral paper. Underneath, as she'd felt before, wasn't plaster. It was a layer of coarse, dark fabric, burlap, perhaps, stiff with age and glue. It covered a small, rectangular cavity in the wall, framed by the wooden studs. And nestled within that cavity, tucked behind the burlap like a precious secret, was the object. It wasn't large. Roughly the size of Eleanor's palm. She reached in, her fingertips brushing against the rough burlap, then closing around cool, smooth wood. She drew it out into the dim hallway light. It was a carving. A cat. Exquisitely detailed, rendered in a rich, dark wood walnut, maybe, polished by time and handling. It sat upright, its tail curled neatly around its front paws, head held high with a quiet dignity. The craftsmanship was remarkable. Every whisker was delicately defined, the curve of the spine graceful, the ears alert. The eyes were inlaid with chips of smooth, pale green stone. Moss agate. They caught the weak light filtering from Eleanor's bedroom doorway, glowing with an inner luminescence that was hauntingly familiar. Eleanor's breath caught. She knew those eyes. That posture. It was the cat from the photograph. Agatha's cat. The sleek, dark tabby sitting on the porch beside the hopeful young Agatha and the kind-faced man. Silas moved. Slowly, deliberately, he walked across the hallway. He stopped a foot away from Eleanor, his own pale green eyes fixed not on her face, but on the wooden cat cradled in her hands. He didn't sniff it. He just looked. A deep, profound stillness settled over him. His gaze traced the curve of the wooden cat's back, the shape of its inlaid eyes. It wasn't curiosity. It was recognition, reverence even. A memory surfaced, sharp and clear. Aunt Agatha, years ago, visiting Eleanor's childhood home. Eleanor, maybe 10, had shown her a treasured, clumsy clay owl she'd made in art class. Agatha had held it, her usual stern expression softening, just for a moment. "We keep the things that hold pieces of our hearts, Eleanor," she'd said, her voice uncharacteristically soft. "Even when the heart changes. Especially then." She'd placed the owl back on the shelf with surprising gentleness. Eleanor had forgotten that moment entirely until now. Tears, hot and sudden, blurred Eleanor's vision. They weren't just tears for Agatha, though they were that, too, for the lonely woman she became, who sealed away this tender memento of a happier time, of love and companionship. They were tears for the silent, dusty cat standing before her, who had guarded this secret, who had somehow known what was hidden, known that it mattered, known that Eleanor needed to find it. They were tears, most unexpectedly, for herself. For the years of building her own walls, of shutting down, of becoming smaller and quieter to avoid the pain of connection failing. For the relief she'd felt when Agatha died, a shameful secret she'd carried like a stone. This small, perfect carving, hidden away with such care, it was Agatha's heart. A heart she had locked away, just as Eleanor had locked away her own. A soft pressure against her leg. Eleanor looked down, blinking through the tears. Silas had closed the distance. He leaned his entire side against her knee, a solid, warm weight. Not tentatively, not fleetingly, firmly, anchoring. His head was still turned towards the wooden cat in her hands, but his body pressed against hers, a silent offering of comfort, of shared understanding. The faint vibration of a purr began, a low, resonant thrum that seemed to emanate from deep within his chest and travel up through her own body, settling the frantic tremor in her hands. Eleanor let out a shuddering breath, a sound somewhere between a sob and a sigh. She lowered one hand from the smooth wood of the carving and rested it gently on Silas's dusty back, feeling the warmth of him, the steady rise and fall of his breathing beneath her palm. The purr intensified, a tangible vibration connecting them. She looked from the wooden cat's agate eyes to Silas's living, pale green gaze, then back again. The resemblance was uncanny, profound. The guardian and the guarded. A legacy passed down through silence and scratches on a wall. The carving wasn't just Agatha's hidden heart. It was Silas's purpose. And now, it was hers too. The oppressive chill of the hallway receded, replaced by the warmth radiating from the cat leaning against her, the solid weight of the carving in her hand, and the overwhelming, bittersweet flood of connection. To Agatha's lost tenderness, to Silas's fierce loyalty, and to the long-buried pieces of her own heart, finally stirring awake. The silence was no longer empty. It was full, resonant with the low thrum of a purr, the echo of a long-kept secret, and the soft, releasing breath of a woman who had finally stopped running from the past and found herself, unexpectedly, home. The breaking point wasn't destruction. It was an unraveling and the beginning of a mend. The carved cat felt warm in Eleanor's palm, as if imbued with the faint, residual heat of Silas's purring body pressed against her knee. The hallway, moments ago a silent theater of revelation, now hummed with a different energy. The low thrum emanating from Silas was the bass note, steady and grounding. Eleanor's own shaky breaths were the melody, slowly finding a calmer rhythm. The tears drying on her cheeks left salty tracks, but the tightness in her chest, the constant knot of guilt and indecision that had resided there since moving in, felt looser. Not gone, but unraveled, like a tightly wound skein of yarn finally allowed to breathe. She didn't move immediately. She sat on the cold floor, the wooden carving cradled in one hand, her other resting lightly on Silas's dusty back, feeling the vibration travel up her arm. The pale green agate eyes of the carving seemed to hold the same quiet intelligence as Silas's own gaze. It wasn't just a likeness, it felt like a lineage. A tangible thread connecting the hopeful young Agatha on the porch, the sleek tabby beside her, and this ragged, loyal guardian who had led Eleanor to this moment. Slowly, carefully, Eleanor turned the carving over in her hands. The dark wood was smooth, polished by countless touches long ago. On the base, carved in a flowing, elegant script she didn't recognize as Agatha's usual tight hand, were words, "For my brave Agatha, always. Thomas." Thomas. The kind-faced man from the photograph. A name. A confirmation. A love sealed away behind layers of wallpaper and years of stern isolation. My brave Agatha. The phrase echoed in the quiet hallway, painting a picture of a woman Eleanor had never known. What had she been brave about? Losing Thomas? Choosing solitude? The questions remained, but they no longer felt like accusations. They felt like part of the story, Agatha's story, now gently unfolding in Eleanor's care. Silas shifted, leaning more heavily against her knee. His purr deepened, a contented rumble. He wasn't looking at the carving anymore. His eyes were half closed, focused on nothing, simply being present. Anchored. The frantic scratching, the intense vigilance, it had eased. His job, it seemed, was done. The secret was found, the guardian acknowledged. The practicalities couldn't be ignored forever. The damaged wallpaper was a glaring wound in the hallway. Eleanor couldn't leave the cavity open, exposing the carved cat's hiding place. But sealing it away again felt wrong. Like reburying Agatha's heart without acknowledgement. She spent the next day carefully, almost reverently, repairing the wall. She didn't rush. She mixed plaster with meticulous care, the dusty, chalky smell filling the hallway, mingling with the scent of old wood and Silas, who had taken up a position nearby, observing with detached interest. She gently cleaned the edges of the torn wallpaper, removing loose flakes. She wouldn't repaper over the cavity. Instead, she carefully fitted a small, thin piece of sanded plywood into the opening, securing it flush with the surrounding plaster. It was a patch, yes, but a visible one. A marker. A quiet testament to what lay beneath. Then, she placed the wooden carving on the small, dusty hall table near the top of the stairs. Not hidden. Not displayed ostentatiously. Just present. Where the light from the window could catch the agate eyes. Where she would see it passing by. Where Silas could see it too. He did. Often. He'd pause on his way to or from the guest room, sit before the table and gaze at the carving. Not with the intense fixation of before, but with a quiet contemplation. A recognition. Sometimes he'd reach out a single paw and gently tap the base. A soft talk sound in the stillness. A greeting? An affirmation? Eleanor didn't know. But it felt right. Life settled into a new rhythm, softer than before. The oppressive silence of the house didn't vanish, but it changed. It became a comfortable quiet, punctuated by the familiar sounds Eleanor was learning to interpret. The soft pad of Silas's paws on the floorboards, the rhythmic rasp of his tongue during grooming sessions on the slightly less dusty rug in the living room, the contented sigh he'd make when settling into a patch of weak afternoon sun that slanted through the cleaner windows. Eleanor found herself talking to him more. Not just filling the silence, but sharing. The furnace guy is coming tomorrow, Silas. Hopefully, he can make it less like living in a refrigerator. Silas, curled on the armchair opposite hers while she worked, would twitch an ear. Acknowledgement. Or, that client finally approved the design. Took them long enough. Silas might lift his head, blink slowly, then tuck his nose back under his tail. A feline shrug. Life went on. He began venturing further. One morning, Eleanor woke to find him not in the hallway or guest room, but sitting on the wide windowsill in her bedroom, gazing out at the gray dawn. He didn't startle when she stirred. He just glanced at her, then resumed his watch on the waking street. A silent sharing of the view. Another morning, she found him exploring the sunroom off the kitchen, a space she'd barely used, sniffing at the leaves of a neglected spider plant. The scratching at the wall stopped completely. The scuffling sounds from the upper floor ceased. Silas seemed at peace. His watchfulness remained, but it was no longer fraught with hidden purpose. It was simply awareness. He slept more deeply, often sprawled on the living room rug, belly exposed in a way he'd never dared before. The deep, resonant purr became a more frequent soundtrack to Eleanor's days. Eleanor, too, felt the shift within herself. The guilt over Agatha hadn't disappeared, but it had transformed. It was no longer a sharp, gnawing thing. It was a softer ache, a recognition of missed connection, tempered now by understanding. She saw Agatha differently. Not just the stern aunt, but the woman who had loved Thomas, who had cherished a cat enough to have it immortalized in wood, who had, in her own way, tried to protect her heart by sealing it away. Eleanor understood that impulse intimately. She'd done the same. Looking at Silas, watching him slowly unfurl from his guarded existence, she saw a reflection of her own tentative opening. She wasn't magically healed. The divorce still stung. Her business was still precarious. The house was still a mountain of repairs. But the crushing loneliness had receded. It had been replaced by a quiet companionship, a shared stewardship of this old house and its secrets. She started tackling small projects not out of grim obligation, but with a sense of tending. She cleaned the grime from the sunroom windows, letting in more light. She sorted through another box of Agatha's things, not with dread, but with a gentle curiosity. She found mismatched china, bundles of letters tied with faded ribbon, unread for now, and a collection of delicate pressed ferns in an old book. She didn't discard them. She arranged the china in a cabinet. She placed the fern book on a shelf beside the wooden cat. Preserving, not erasing. One rainy afternoon, much like the one when she'd first seen Silas, she sat on the living room floor with a cup of tea, sketching idly in a notebook, not client work, just shapes, patterns. Silas lay nearby on the rug, a soft gray comma. The wind rattled the windows, the rain drummed steadily. It was the kind of weather that used to amplify her isolation, making the house feel like a ship adrift in a cold sea. Now it felt cozy, contained. Silas lifted his head, yawned widely, showing tiny, sharp teeth and a pink tongue. He stretched, his spine elongating, his front paws reaching forward. Then he stood, shook himself, sending a small cloud of dust motes dancing in the lamplight, and padded over to her. He didn't curl up beside her. He stepped deliberately onto her open sketchbook, walked across the paper, leaving faint smudges from his pads, and settled himself squarely in her lap. Eleanor froze, her breath catching. He'd never initiated contact like this. He was warm, solid, heavier than she expected. His fur, still slightly dusty but cleaner than before, was soft against her hands. He kneaded her thigh gently for a moment, a rhythmic pressing of paws, then settled with a deep, rumbling sigh, his head resting on her arm. His eyes closed. Trusting. The warmth of him seeped through her sweatpants. The vibration of his purr resonated deep in her own core. Outside, the storm continued, but inside, in the circle of lamplight, with the wooden cat watching serenely from the hall table visible through the doorway, there was only warmth and quiet and the profound comfort of a shared stillness. The house wasn't just shelter anymore. It was becoming a home. Not perfect, not finished, but theirs. The past wasn't buried, it was integrated, a quiet presence in the corner of the room. The future wasn't a threatening unknown. It was the next repair, the next sketch, the next quiet moment with a purring cat in her lap. The choice to stay wasn't about being trapped. It was about being rooted. And Silas, this unexpected, dusty guardian, was the anchor. The quiet shift in her heart had become a steady, grounding beat. Silas in her lap became a revelation. That solid weight, the deep, resonant purr vibrating through her bones, the soft press of his head against her arm, it wasn't just physical comfort. It was a profound dismantling of the last, invisible barrier Eleanor hadn't realized she still held. The one that whispered you are alone, you must be self-sufficient, connection is temporary and will hurt. Silas, with his dusty fur and ancient eyes, had bulldozed it with a simple act of trust. He chose her lap. He chose her. The house breathed differently after that. The air felt lighter, warmer, even as winter tightened its grip outside. Eleanor found herself humming while washing dishes. She opened curtains wider, chasing the weak December sun. She even started a fire in the long-dormant living room fireplace one frigid evening, the crackle and pop of wood joining Silas's purr as he stretched luxuriously on the hearthrug, soaking in the radiant heat. The carved cat watched from the hall table, its agate eyes catching the flickering light. It wasn't a shrine, it was a companion piece. A reminder of where the story began. Silas, too, seemed to embrace his new role as resident lapcat and hearth guardian. He followed Eleanor from room to room with a quiet assurance that hadn't been there before. He'd supervise her attempts at patching plaster in the dining room ceiling, a leak discovered after heavy snow, sitting regally on a stepladder step. He'd nap in sunbeams on the newly cleaned sunroom floor, a soft gray puddle of contentment. He developed a fondness for the specific texture of the old velvet armchair in the living room, kneading it with deep satisfaction before curling up, often with one paw draped possessively over Eleanor's discarded sweater if she left it there. One crisp Saturday morning, with weak sunlight filtering through the high windows, Eleanor decided it was time. Time for Silas to see the vet. The guilt over his initial neglected state still pricked, but more than that, a quiet worry had settled in. He seemed content, yes, but he was clearly very old. How old? How long had he truly been the silent guardian of Agatha's secret? His matted fur was mostly gone now, brushed out over patient weeks, revealing a surprisingly thick, soft undercoat, still predominantly gray and muted tabby, but with patches of a warmer, almost russet brown she hadn't noticed before. He ate well, purred constantly, but he slept more than ever, and sometimes, watching him jump down from the windowsill, she saw a slight stiffness, a hint of effort. The carrier was an ordeal. Silas, usually so composed, transformed. His eyes widened, pupils dilating into black pools of primal panic. He hissed, a sound Eleanor had never heard from him before, low and guttural and full of terror. He backed into the farthest corner under her bed, a trembling, dusty shadow. It took patience, gentle coaxing, and ultimately, the strategic placement of his favorite salmon-flavored treats to lure him near the carrier's open door. Even then, getting him inside involved a heartbreaking moment of betrayed trust, his claws scrabbling desperately against the plastic floor before the door clicked shut. His plaintive yowl from within the carrier echoed through the quiet house, a sound of utter desolation. The drive was tense. Silas alternated between frantic scrabbling and eerie, silent stillness. Eleanor talked to him constantly, her voice low and soothing, telling him about the nice doctor, promising salmon for dinner, apologizing over and over. She felt like a traitor. Dr. Evans' clinic was small, modern, and smelled sharply of antiseptic and anxious animals. Silas remained rigidly silent in his carrier, pressed against the back wall, his green eyes huge and unblinking through the mesh door. When the vet tech, a cheerful young woman named Chloe, gently lifted him out, he went completely limp, a tactic of utter surrender that was somehow more distressing than his earlier panic. He didn't struggle. He just shut down. His eyes fixed on a point on the wall, distant and terrified. Dr. Evans herself was calm, efficient, with kind eyes and gentle hands. She examined Silas thoroughly while Eleanor explained his history, the discovery in the house, the probable neglect, the scratching at the wall, the finding of the carving. She mentioned the photograph, the sleek tabby that looked so like the carving, and so like Silas underneath the dust and age. "He's quite the character," Dr. Evans murmured, running her hands over his spine, palpating his abdomen, listening to his heart with a stethoscope. Silas remained passive, trembling faintly. Definitely geriatric. Significant dental wear, some arthritis developing in the hips, but his heart sounds strong. Lungs are clear. Remarkably good muscle tone for his age, considering. She checked his eyes with a light, and Silas finally blinked, his pupils contracting. "Eyes are cloudy with age-related changes, but he can see you, don't worry. His vision is just a bit foggy." She gently lifted his lip to examine his teeth again, frowning slightly. "This tartar buildup, it's heavy. Consistent with older cats who haven't had dental care. But the patterns..." She looked closer, then glanced at Eleanor. "You said he belonged to your aunt? How long ago did she pass?" "About 4 months ago," Eleanor answered. "But I only found Silas trapped in the utility closet a week after I moved in, 3 months ago. The lawyer never mentioned a cat. I assumed he'd been there since she died." Dr. Evans nodded slowly, her expression thoughtful. She continued the exam, checking his claws, feeling his joints. "He's microchipped," she announced suddenly, running the scanner over his shoulder. "That's good news." She noted the number and tapped it into her computer. A moment later, her eyebrows shot up. She looked from the screen to Silas, then back to Eleanor, her expression one of profound surprise. "Ms. Reed, according to the microchip registry, this cat was implanted 18 years ago." Silence descended in the small exam room. The only sound was the faint hum of the overhead lights and Silas's rapid, shallow breathing. 18 years. Eleanor felt the world tilt slightly. 18 years ago, Agatha would have been late 60s? The timeline fit. The sleek tabby in the photograph, if it was the same cat, would have been young then. But 18 years was ancient for a cat. Extremely ancient. Silas wasn't just old, he was a relic. 18, Eleanor whispered, staring at Silas, who had finally turned his head, his pale green eyes meeting hers, wide with residual fear but also a flicker of recognition at her voice. Dr. Evans nodded, her gaze returning to the screen, then back to Silas with new respect. "Registered to Agatha Finch at 17 Maple Street. Merlin." She gave a small, wry smile. Appropriate, given the apparent magic trick of his longevity. He must have been incredibly well cared for, at least for most of his life. Genetics play a role, but environment is crucial for reaching such an age. He's a testament to your aunt's care, Ms. Reed. Merlin's own remarkable resilience. Merlin. Eleanor repeated the name silently. It suited him far better than Silas ever had. The wise old wizard, keeper of secrets. She reached out, her fingers trembling slightly, and gently stroked the fur between his ears. "Hello, Merlin," she breathed. He leaned infinitesimally into her touch, a silent sigh escaping him. The revelation settled over Eleanor like a warm, heavy cloak. 18 years. He hadn't just guarded Agatha's secret, he was Agatha's secret. A living, breathing piece of her aunt's hidden tenderness, the love she'd shared with Thomas. He'd witnessed Agatha's transformation from the hopeful young woman to the stern, isolated figure Eleanor knew. He'd survived her decline, her death, months of terrifying solitude, and he'd waited. Waited for Eleanor. Waited to show her the truth hidden in the wall. Waited to finally be found, not just physically, but known. Truly known. The drive home was different. Merlin, exhausted by the ordeal, slept deeply in the carrier on the passenger seat, a soft, wheezing snore emanating from within. Eleanor kept one hand resting lightly on the carrier, a point of contact. Her mind whirled. 18 years. The carved cat, Thomas's gift to his brave Agatha, suddenly held even deeper resonance. Had Merlin been the model? The sleek, dark tabby immortalized in wood? The companion to both Agatha and Thomas? Back at Maple Street, Eleanor carried the carrier inside, setting it gently on the hall floor near the table where the carved cat sat. She opened the door. Merlin emerged slowly, blinking in the familiar dimness. He stretched stiffly, then looked around, his gaze sweeping the hallway, lingering for a moment on the carving, then settling on Eleanor. He took a few tentative steps, then paused, looking back at her. Not with fear, with expectation. Eleanor understood. She knelt. He walked over, not to her lap this time, but pressed his entire side along her folded legs, rubbing his cheek against her knee, marking her. A slow, rumbling purr started deep in his chest, shaky at first, then gaining strength. It was a different purr. Not just contentment. It sounded like relief. Like coming home after a long, arduous journey. Like a story finally being told. Later, after Merlin had eaten his promised salmon and settled like a small, warm furnace on the rug before the crackling fire, Eleanor felt a new pull. Not to the wall. To the boxes. Specifically, to the box marked Agatha's desk she'd pushed aside weeks ago, overwhelmed. She carried it to the living room, setting it on the floor near Merlin. He opened one eye, watching as she lifted the lid. Inside were the expected detritus of a life, dried-up ink bottles, rubber bands hardened to brittle loops, paper clips, a magnifying glass with a cracked lens. And tucked beneath a stack of unused, yellowed stationery, bound with a faded blue ribbon, a bundle of letters. Eleanor's breath caught. The paper was thin, crackly with age. The handwriting on the top envelope was the same flowing script as the inscription on the carved cat's base. Thomas. With trembling fingers, Eleanor untied the ribbon. The scent that rose was faint old paper, dried ink, and the ghost of lavender. She lifted the first letter, dated May 12, 1957. My dearest Agatha, it began. The city feels impossibly gray and loud without you. Every corner reminds me of your laugh, the way you tilt your head when you're thinking hard, the absolute terror on your face when that spider descended onto our picnic blanket. Merlin, the brave knight, dispatched it with admirable efficiency, as I recall. Eleanor read, the fire crackling, Merlin purring softly on the rug. Letter after letter unfolded a love story. Thomas's job kept him traveling, but his words flew back to Agatha and Merlin at 17 Maple Street. He wrote of missing her, of plans for their future, of silly jokes only they would understand, of his admiration for her strength as she cared for her ailing mother alone in the big house. He wrote of Merlin's antics, bringing a half-dead mouse to the doorstep, like a grisly tribute, sleeping curled on Agatha's typewriter keys, hissing at the vacuum cleaner with the fury of a tiny dragon. Then the tone shifted. Letters became less frequent. Worry crept in. Agatha's mother was failing. Thomas was stuck on a prolonged assignment. The last letter, dated October 3, 1958, was different. The paper was crumpled in places as if handled repeatedly. The ink was slightly blurred in spots. My brave, brave Agatha. Words feel hollow against the weight of your news. My heart aches for you, my darling, across all these miles. To lose your mother, and then this cruel twist. I feel helpless. Useless. I'm trying, Aggie. I swear I'm pulling every string, but this contract, it's ironclad. They won't release me, not even for this. The injustice of it burns. You shouldn't have to face this alone. You should have me there, holding your hand, fighting with you. Please, my love, don't shut me out. Don't pull away. Let me come home, even if just for a week. Let me help you carry this. The letter ended abruptly and signed. Eleanor stared at the page, the pieces clicking into place with devastating clarity. 1958, the year of the building permit for interior structural modifications. Agatha, grieving her mother, facing another devastating blow alone because Thomas couldn't get home. What was the cruel twist? Illness? Financial ruin? The letter didn't say, but it explained the distance in the later Agatha Eleanor knew. It explained the sealing away of Thomas's gift, too painful a reminder of love and support snatched away when she needed it most. It explained the walls, literal and emotional. Agatha hadn't chosen isolation. It had been forced upon her by circumstance and loss. And Merlin had been there through it all. The witness, the silent companion, the keeper of the flame. Eleanor looked up from the fragile pages. Merlin was watching her, his green eyes reflecting the firelight, ancient and knowing. He gave a slow, deliberate blink. Yes, it seemed to say, now you see. The final gift wasn't just Merlin's true name, his astonishing history. It wasn't just the letters revealing Agatha's hidden tragedy. It was the profound understanding that settled over Eleanor like a mantle. Love could be interrupted. Life could be brutally unfair. Walls could be built for survival, not malice. And sometimes, the bravest thing wasn't fighting the storm, but enduring it and leaving a light on, however hidden, for someone else to find later. Merlin had been Agatha's light. And now, impossibly wonderfully, he was hers. The carved cat wasn't just a memento, it was a baton passed. A legacy of love, loss, and quiet, enduring guardianship. Eleanor carefully retied the blue ribbon around the letters, her fingers brushing the carved cat's smooth flank. She wasn't just Agatha's heir. She was Merlin's keeper. And the story, she realized, wasn't over. It had simply found its next chapter. Winter deepened its hold on Maple Street, transforming the world outside the old Victorian into a monochrome sketchbook. Snow piled high on the porch rails, muffling the world into a profound, crystalline silence. Inside, however, the house on Maple Street hummed with a quiet, resilient warmth it hadn't known in decades. It wasn't the roar of constant activity, but the deep, resonant thrum of life, patiently endured and now, tentatively, embraced. Eleanor moved through the rooms with a new kind of ownership. It wasn't just about deeds and repairs anymore, it was stewardship. Stewardship of Agatha's hidden history, of Thomas's enduring love carved in wood and whispered in faded ink, and most profoundly, of Merlin. Merlin. The name felt right on her tongue now, a key fitting a lock she hadn't known existed. His true name, his astonishing age, 18 years a silent sentinel in this house, settled around her shoulders like a cloak woven from time itself. He wasn't just a cat, he was a chronicle. A living archive of Agatha's joys and sorrows, her bravery and her retreat. The bundle of Thomas's letters, retied with their faded blue ribbon, lived in the top drawer of Eleanor's desk. She hadn't read them all yet. Some truths needed space to breathe. She knew enough. She knew the shape of the love that had bloomed here, the cruel twist of fate that had severed it, the grief that had turned Agatha inward, sealing away her heart and her cat's true identity. She knew why the wall had been modified, why the carving had been hidden, not out of shame, but out of a pain too acute to bear daily witness. Agatha hadn't been cold, she'd been cauterized. And Merlin had stayed. Through it all. The constant. The silent witness who never judged, only endured, and finally guided. Merlin himself seemed to embody a quiet contentment that bordered on the regal. The vet visit ordeal had faded, replaced by an even deeper bond forged in the shared understanding of his revealed past. He accepted his new name with a slow blink, as if acknowledging a truth long known only to him. His days were a gentle rhythm of sunbeams, tracked with the precision of a sundial, hearty meals of senior formula salmon pat, deep, rumbling naps before the fire Eleanor kept burning most days, and his favorite pastime, supervising Eleanor from the velvet armchair or, increasingly, from the comfort of her lap as she sketched or read. The stiffness in his hips was more noticeable now, especially on cold mornings. Eleanor had placed small footstools strategically near his favorite perches, the windowsill, the armchair, the foot of her bed. He used them with careful dignity, a small hop-up, a pause, then settling. She'd find herself watching him sometimes, not with pity, but with awe. 18 years. The sleek phantom from the photograph, Agatha's young companion, Thomas's brave knight, was now this dusty, gray-muzzled elder, his steps measured, his purr a constant, grounding vibration. His pale green eyes, cloudy with age but still startlingly intelligent, held galaxies of memory. When he looked at the carved cat on the hall table, which he still did most days, touching its base with a gentle paw, it wasn't just recognition. It was communion. A silent conversation across the years with the creature he once was, and with the hands that had carved his likeness out of love. Eleanor's own thaw continued. The house repairs progressed slowly, steadily. She tackled them not as burdens, but as acts of care. Patching plaster felt like healing a wound. Cleaning a grimy window felt like letting in light, literally and metaphorically. She started a small project, restoring the sunroom. Clearing out decades of accumulated junk, scrubbing the tile floor, washing the tall windows until they sparkled. She envisioned plants there eventually, maybe a comfortable chair for reading, a sunny spot specifically for Merlin. It felt like building a future within the bones of the past, honoring both. One late February afternoon, the sky a hard, brilliant blue, the snow blindingly white, Eleanor sat on the living room floor, her back against the sofa, sketchbook open. She wasn't drawing client concepts. She was sketching Merlin, asleep on the rug, a patch of sunlight warming his flank. She focused on the curve of his spine, the way his front paws tucked under him, the soft drape of his tail. She tried to capture the texture of his fur, the dust motes dancing in the sunbeam beside him, the profound peace in his posture. Merlin stirred, opening one eye. He watched her hand move across the paper for a moment, then slowly, deliberately, stood up. He stretched, his movements slow and careful, then walked over to her. Not to her lap this time. He nudged her knee with his head, a soft request. She shifted her sketchbook. He stepped onto it, walked across the unfinished drawing, leaving faint smudges, and settled himself not on the paper, but beside her, pressing his entire warm length against her leg. He laid his head on her thigh, sighed deeply, and closed his eyes. His purr started, a low, contented engine. Eleanor set her pencil down. She rested her hand lightly on his head, feeling the vibration travel up her arm, settling deep in her chest. She looked around the room. The fire crackled softly. The carved cat watched serenely from the hallway. Outside, the winter world was stark and beautiful. Inside, it was warm, alive, resonant with the sound of a contented cat and the quiet beat of her own, no longer lonely heart. This, she realized, gazing down at Merlin's sleeping face, the lines of age softened in repose, was the meaning. The universal truth woven through Agatha's hidden pain, Thomas's lost letters, Merlin's enduring vigil, and her own journey from isolation to connection. It wasn't about grand gestures or fairy tale endings. It was about the profound courage found in staying. In enduring the storms life throws, grief, loss, betrayal, loneliness, and finding a way to keep a light burning, however small. Agatha had done it, sealing her light away in a wall and in the silent presence of her cat. Merlin had done it, surviving abandonment, guarding a secret, waiting with ancient patience. And Ellen, she was learning to do it. Not by building higher walls, but by slowly, carefully letting them down. By choosing to stay in the imperfect, creaky house. By choosing to care for the ancient cat. By choosing to uncover the past, not to dwell in it, but to understand it, to integrate it, to find her place within its long, echoing story. Love wasn't always forever in the way we hope. Thomas and Agatha's story was a testament to that. But love endured. It transformed. It lived on in carved wood, in faded ink, in the purr of an ancient cat who had witnessed it all. It lived on in the quiet choice to open the door, to listen to the scratching on the wall, to follow the silent guide. It lived on in the courage to mend what was broken, both in plaster and in spirit. Merlin's purr deepened, a rhythmic counterpoint to the ticking of the old wall clock. Eleanor leaned her head back against the sofa, closing her eyes, simply feeling the warmth of him, the solid reality of his presence. The house, Agatha's house, Merlin's house, her house now, held them both. It held the echoes of laughter and tears, of love found and lost, of secrets kept and finally revealed. It held the quiet miracle of a second chance, not to rewrite the past, but to find peace within its long shadow. The silence wasn't empty anymore. It was full. Full of memory, full of presence, full of the soft, resonant sound of a heart finally, truly, coming home. The story hadn't ended with Agatha's passing, or with the finding of the carving. It was a continuous thread, woven through generations, through joy and sorrow, now gently passing through Eleanor's hands, and resting, warm and purring, against her side. The final snow of the season began to fall outside, silent and soft, blanketing the world in fresh, forgiving white. Inside, by the fire's glow, an old cat dreamed his ancient dreams, and the woman beside him, her hand resting lightly on his head, watched the flames dance, her face peaceful in the flickering light. The carved cat watched over them all, its agate eyes holding the quiet wisdom of the ages, that love, in all its forms, is the only magic that truly lasts. And sometimes, the bravest thing, the most transformative thing, is simply to let it in. If this story of a lonely house, a silent cat, and the hidden secrets that brought them home found its way into your heart, if you felt that quiet shift, that spark of connection, then you understand the magic. Like this video if you believed in Merlin's mission. Comment below with the moment that touched you most. Subscribe and hit the bell because real life holds the most powerful stories of all, and we share them here every single day. Share this with someone who needs a reminder that even in the quietest corners, love waits to be found. Thank you for watching, for listening, for being part of this journey home.